In this video, we're going to look at some surprising coincidences in the Bible, especially from the books of Daniel and Revelation. We're going to try and make sense of some hard-to-understand passages that relate to world history and the end of the present age. As it says in the book of Revelation, some of this calls for wisdom, so be prepared to think carefully and critically. Let's also make something clear. As you will see, we're not going to predict when Jesus will return. Jesus specifically taught that no one except God himself knows this, and you should therefore not believe anyone who tells you otherwise. Still, there is a difference between predicting a date and knowing the times and seasons, because Jesus also said in the context of his return that from the seasons we would know that the end is near. Knowing the seasons is something we will have to leave for another video. Let's look at a few verses I've selected from the Bible, just focusing for the moment on the numerical values. We'll talk about the topics later. Think about this purely from a mathematical point of view for a moment. What common factors do you see in these numbers? If you do the factorization, you will see a number of exact factors: 30, 42, and 3.5, 3.5. If we also take into account that these verses all include units of time, days, months and years, we can also say mathematically that units of time are a common factor too. Not only that, but if we assume for a moment that a month is 30 days long and a year is 360 days long, then the connections between the verses get even stronger. So you may say, well, but not all months are 30 days long. Some are 31, some are 28 or 29, and a year certainly isn't 360 days long. So doesn't that create a problem for all these so-called coincidences? If you're saying that, then I'm willing to bet that you are not watching this video from the ancient world. There's evidence that from around 1800 BC to 800 BC, many civilizations, including the Egyptians, Assyrians, Babylonians, Hebrews, and even Mayans and Aztecs, used a calendar with a 360-day year. Not only that, but the 360-day year is still used even today by accountants for applications including calculation of interest. With the benefit of modern astronomy, we know, of course, that for every one revolution of the Earth around the Sun, the Earth rotates around 365.25 times. So the problem of the 360-day year is really no different from the problem of the 365-day year. Unless you periodically adjust, which we do today through leap years, after some time you would find that January begins to come in the middle of summer, and make that winter if you live in the southern hemisphere. In the ancient world, this adjustment could instead be made through leap months instead of leap years. This is all a little bit of a sidetrack. The point is that we only assume a year can't be 360 days long because we're so used to the modern calendar. Since much of the Bible was written in the time period when a 360-day year and a 30-day month were widely used, it makes complete sense to modify our mathematics and change the approximations to exact equalities. But now we have to think about another apparent disconnect. In two cases here where we find a 3.5 factor, we also find a 360 factor implying 3.5 years. But in the other, the one with the weeks, we find a 3.5 factor without any obvious way to link the remaining factors to a year-long time period. In order to make sense of this, we have to change tack and look at the Bible reference from a linguistic point of view. Daniel 9:24 says, 70 weeks are decreed about your people in your holy city, to finish the transgression, to put an end to sin, and to atone for iniquity, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal both vision and prophet, and to anoint a most holy place. The word for weeks here in Hebrew literally just means sevens. It is the word from which we get the English word Sabbath, because, as Genesis says, God instituted a Sabbath on the seventh day of the week after his work of creation, for the purpose of rest. And of course, this is one part of the ancient calendar that we still have today in every major culture around the world. Different religions, Christianity, Islam, and Judaism in particular, do have different days of the week of their days of rest, but they all observe a weekly cycle. And by the way, just because I say this, don't please infer that all religions are somehow equally good ways to God. Anyway, back to the verse. So it would be reading less into the verse to translate it as 70 sevens are decreed about your people in your holy city, and so on and so on. It's still clear from the context, even though we now can't say that the sevens are groups of 7 days, that we are still talking about some kind of period of time. So this means we would have to rewrite our factorization as shown here. Since in the two cases that we were able to reconcile together, that's number 1 and 2, since in those cases we figured out that they both come to 3.5 years, in other words, when we pull out a factor of 3.5, we also have the common years factor. Let's just assume for the time being that the unspecified period of time in number 4 is in fact years as well. Now I realise at some point some people watching may consider this to be a bit of a stretch. So just allow me to proceed for the moment on the assumption that the sevens are in fact 7-year periods. But do hold your objections, and I think I will have addressed them by the time we finish. The verses following Daniel 9:24 actually give us some more clues that will help. So let's look at all of Daniel 9:24 to 29. First of all, we have to realize that this was a speech given by an angel to Daniel soon after he had prayed a prayer for his people Israel, who at that time were in captivity. If we look at verse 2 of Daniel chapter 9, which we don't show here, we'll also see that Daniel was prompted to pray because he had just read from Jeremiah's prophecy that the desolations of Jerusalem, so that's the captivity of Israel, were to end after 70 years, which at the time Daniel prayed were soon to end. So the context of the angel's speech was clearly the prophetic history of Israel. And just another short side note here. We do see 70 years in verse 2 and 77s in verse 24. So we have yet another common factor of 70, and some people interpreting this chapter have mistakenly assumed that because of this, the 70 years is the same time period as the 77s. Now the common factor may not be a coincidence, but there is more than one reason it is a mistake to equate the two. If 70 years was equal to 77s, 1 year would have to equal 1 7, but the problem is 7 does not divide into a year, nor does it divide into 12 or 360 in any kind of obvious way. There is a connection between 70 years and 77s, which we don't have time to discuss more here, except to say that it is explained in a number of other verses. So let's revisit where we are so far with our factorization of Daniel 9:26. We have 70 groups of 7 years is equal to 70 groups of 3.5 times 2 years. And now let's look back at what the angel said to Daniel, and we'll just look purely mathematically again at first. So based on what the angel said, we can modify our factorization as follows, to show first that the 70 breaks down into 69 plus 1, and then that the 69 breaks down into 7 plus 62, and the 1 breaks into 2 halves. Let's ignore the 7 plus 62 for the moment and start by multiplying throughout by 7. We're still assuming that the unit here is years, as I said before, but notice how one element here is a period of 0.5 times 7 years, which is equal to 3.5 years, 3.5 years, the same period of time mentioned in Revelation 11:2-3, Revelation 12:6 and Revelation 13:5. Now compare what these verses actually say about the 3.5 year period. So here we see we have the following things going on in that 3.5 year period or periods. We have witnesses prophesying, the nations treading on the holy city, Jerusalem. Third, a woman taken care of by God in the wilderness after having fled there. And fourth, a beast uttering haughty and blasphemous words and exercising authority. So now let's expand how we look at the different verses, not just mathematically now, but also topically. We shouldn't necessarily assume that just because in all cases we have 3.5-year periods, it's the same 3.5 years in all cases, particularly as we already made an assumption that the last reference is in fact talking about 3.5 years, half of a 7. But note also now the topical similarities. We've got a beast exercising authority, or uttering haughty and blasphemous words, the nations treading on Jerusalem. None of these things sound like good things to me. Moreover, the idea of the woman fleeing into the wilderness to be taken care of by God suggests that she had to flee something bad to take refuge. So we've got here an accumulation of evidence. We've got the numerical factors and we have a topical similarity. That leads me to believe that in fact all these verses are talking about the same 3.5-year period, and that this 3.5-year period represents some evil times. And moreover, I think we're now a long way towards answering the objection I raised earlier that it might be too much of a stretch to make that the 7s of Daniel 9 are in fact 7-year periods. I also believe that this is the same period of time, by the way, also referred to elsewhere as the tribulation, or the time of Jacob's trouble, although mostly, I think that's a topic for another time. But for more details on what happens in this tribulation period, you can read Revelation 13 for one. I don't know about you, but I'm anxious to know one or two practical things about this evil period lasting 3.5 years prophesied by an angel to Daniel more than 2 millennia ago. First thing I'd like to know is, will I have to live through it? And the second is, how will it end? The second of those questions is fairly easy to answer from the Bible. Daniel 9:27 says directly that the 3.5-year period will go on until the decreed end is poured out on the desolator. I understand that desolator to be Satan. Remember, he's also referred to as the beast in Revelation 11-13 and in Daniel 7. And Daniel 7 also tells us a little bit more about his end. After he is slain, then like a son of man, and that's Jesus, will come with the clouds of heaven and reign forever. You can also read the later chapters of Revelation to find out more about the final downfall of Satan. And these, by the way, are chapters in Revelation that instill great fear in demons, but they should give you and me great hope. Now, the other question, will I have to live through the evil 3.5 years? This is harder to answer for sure. I think the bad news is that this period is still in the future, and I'll say why in a minute. The good news for those of us who follow Jesus is that whatever happens, he will bring us through it. And the even better news, if you believe in a pre-tribulation rapture of the church, which I do, is that those who believe in Jesus will be spared even living through the evil time. Still, whatever we believe on this point, there's nothing we can do to change the course of events, except, of course, to believe in Jesus, follow him, and turn away from the things which he says are wrong, which will for sure change at least our own individual course of events. Now, why must the tribulation be in the future? Well, look back at what Daniel 9 actually says. 77s are decreed about your people in your holy city, to finish the transgression, to put an end to sin, and to atone for iniquity, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal both vision and prophet, and to anoint a most holy place. We know that the decreed end is the downfall of Satan, ushering in the everlasting reign of Jesus. While Jesus did defeat Satan at the cross, I see that as the battle that determined the eventual outcome of the war. It seems quite clear to me that an end has not yet been put to sin, and everlasting righteousness has not yet been brought in. If we are already in everlasting righteousness, well, sorry, but I find it unsatisfactory. And I believe the Bible teaches us to expect more anyway. So, I don't think we can be at the end of the 77s yet.